was going to say, thanks for sticking with right to the end. I'm going to reward you now with 20 minutes of game theory, so. What do you have going on? Right. Okay, hello everyone. My name is Lucas. Thank you so much for sticking around. I'm absolutely thrilled to present to you some of the results from my master's thesis that I've just completed at Imperial. I was looking at investor responses to climate change risk, and specifically I was looking at how investors are working with companies and what are the conditions for effective stewardship when they try to engage in those activities. So just before I continue, a big thank you to my supervisors, Mark, Kaveh, and Ben, and the interviewees who informed sort of my opinion and the direction that this work needed to take. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the context of the research, the conflicts that I identified, the questions that I tried to ask, and then some of the insights that I tentatively put to you, and I look forward to your feedback. So the first piece of the puzzle is the context. We have a 2-degree warming limit. We have a carbon budget. According to that limit, if we allocate it by region, we find it here. And we also find that the valuations of the fossil fuel companies who own those proven reserves is incompatible with that budget. Pretty straightforward. Second, from this summer, we have a piece of work that quantified the climate change value at risk. So this is in present value on a total population of manageable financial assets of 140 trillion approximately. So you can see here in the various warming scenarios, we get up into quite meaningful percentages of impact. And then the last one is the fossil fuel divestment campaign, and 350 updated their numbers just a couple days ago, so we have bigger numbers to tell you today, which is great. And just to, I think, answer one of the questions from earlier, they haven't actually broken out. They've broken it out by partial divestment or full divestment of fossil fuels, but they haven't broken out the various proportions of institutions yet. So there's still some data behind the wall. So I went around and talked to some professionals in the energy industry, the finance industry, and then several people in academia, NGOs, and regulatory positions, just to see where the overlaps were in terms of the conflicts that they identified. So the first one is the effect that perception of the divestment campaign and how the divestment campaign and stranded assets dialogues have changed their perception. And we had some great speakers yesterday about how perception is changing. And one of the interesting things I thought came up was how it's changing internal to the organization. So people are worried about their jobs and they're bringing this up to management. The next one is a difference of horizons, so short-term versus long-term. We've talked a lot about that scrimmage line of capital deployment and the CapEx plans of these companies, but there's also interesting dynamics around the risk horizons of companies versus the risk horizons of investors, and how are those different and what problems is that causing. Third, engagement from passive managers. This could be both with a capital P, and we're talking about index trackers and how they aren't engaging right now, or with a lowercase p, which is just the general apathy, which previous speakers have talked about as well. Regional differences, really this is a difference between EU and USA, investor and company perspectives. We've talked a little bit about that, and we have the great example of the 6 European majors calling for a carbon price and no response or worse from American majors. Benefits, costs, and strategies of engagement. This is what I'm going to talk a little bit about today and what's working and what's not working. And then third-party influence. So most of the people I talked to identified how policymakers have a role to play and how investors can engage with policymakers, but then also how proxy advisory firms might have a role to play as well. And there's a couple large players in that space who maybe might be able to have their opinion changed and then could have real impacts in how shareholder voting goes. So coming out of this, my hypothesis, I'm going to investigate whether shareholder engagement can sufficiently influence oil and gas company investment decisions to mitigate climate change risks. So if I'm going to look at how companies are making decisions, if I'm going to look at how investors are making decisions, I'm getting into this rational utility space that I think some of the speakers yesterday identified. So this is the field of decision theory. But the decisions of these different actors are interacting with each other. And so they're making strategic moves to interact and counteract with each other. Their decisions are strategic. So that puts us into a subset of theory called game theory. And before I've developed some models, but before I go any further, just in complete disclosure, they're more descriptive than prescriptive. Errol Rubinstein, a very famous game theorist, doesn't think much of his own field. So look forward to your input. So this is a graph form game. The great advantage of this game is that it's completely anecdotal. It's totally descriptive, and it's really easy to interpret. So I'll just walk you through how this game is formed. So we might choose, let's say, 2 agents, let's call them, and we're going to give them an option each, a strategy option. So our investor can divest, our company can take action. Based on that, it means there's only 4 possible states of existence for these 2 agents. We're going to give them personalities. So we might say that the company would prefer to take action over the investor divesting. And then that leads us, with a couple fancy algorithms, into some statement of what the strategic equilibria between these 2 players might be. So we see the first equilibria is a divestment equilibria. We start at Nash, which some of you might be familiar with, and then we move into these sort of higher order rationality equilibria, which are a little bit stronger and are one of the particular advantages of graph form games. So we see a divestment equilibria and an action equilibria, and I just told you that those higher order ones are a little bit stronger. So we might say here that the action equilibria is actually stronger in this case than the divestment equilibria, and that's what we would expect to see between these 2 players. And given the personality that I just told you, certainly that would have been apparent, right? But we can add on several layers of complexity. We can develop different personality scenarios of what the investor might prefer, what the company might prefer. We can add in a policymaker who might influence the situation. We're getting into more complicated scenarios, and then we see a number of different equilibria fallout. So I'm not going to go into each one of them, but you can see that this sort of model is quite accessible. The problem, okay, let's go through some conclusions. Right. So the first thing to take away from the work that we did using this model was that divestment can act as a very credible threat in the right circumstances. So provided that the investor is giving indications that they're willing to divest, and the company is responsive to those indications, then it can serve as a credible threat to action. And actually, I personally think this is one of the early contributions that the divestment campaign has made, is to demonstrate a credibility of that threat. And maybe coal companies and oil sands companies are sort of the ones who are taking the fall for that, but the real engagement will come with the oil and gas majors. A couple other, so when we add a third party, we see that they are able to be either successfully lobbied or they're able to be a real player. And one of the other things to take away is that when a third party is willing to act in this situation, it actually elicits anticipatory action from the participants. So the way I interpret this is the importance of policy direction, which can then sort of lead the actors into doing the right thing anyway. So this is great, though, from a very wide-angle strategic type investigation. So let's get a little bit closer and look at how relationships between 2 investors or an investor in a company might actually play out. So we're using a social dilemma game, and I could explain it, but the very best thing to do would be to use an example. So I was talking to one of our colleagues yesterday, and he told a story about how he was working with a company on an engagement on a carbon issue, and they agreed that there wouldn't be a shareholder proposal. There would just be there was an engagement and an accord was drawn, and then so they went away happy. But then when it came time to deliver, the company shirked on their responsibility and they didn't deliver what they said they would do. So this is a very typical prisoner's dilemma type scenario. So I'm not sure if it's necessarily worth going into the details, but what happens is we get a non-cooperative solution when for a social benefit we would want a cooperative solution. And so what happened was the company took the temptation situation and the shareholder was left being the sucker who made the effort in the first place. So how do we solve a hard problem like this? What we do is we play this game many times between the same 2 players, and then they're able to develop conditions of trust and trust and loyalty to each other, I think was the exact words from earlier. And then we see more cooperative experiences come out. So we play with a couple variables. So we've defined just a simple cost-benefit scenario. We have a discount factor that we use as well. So yellow being here, areas of high cooperation, and blue being low. What we see here is that the costs dominate the relationship between the two agents more than the benefits. And then obviously we need a high or a low discount factor rather, so that the agents benefit they benefit from their future interactions with each other. And then if we look at foresight and memory and history of the agents, we see, again, interesting patterns. We know that we have to anticipate future relationships with each other in order to want to cooperate today. But if we remember that time from 2 years ago where they shirked on their responsibility, then we're less likely to trust our opposite and we're more likely to have non-cooperative outcomes. So what are some of the conclusions here? Costs dominate, but they need not be actual physical costs either. They can just be simply the laziness of the management team or something like this. These are just sort of subjective costs. And the other takeaway, I was thinking about foresight horizons and the problem with passive managers. And I thought maybe it might be the limited foresights, either in the business models or the market beliefs, market efficiency beliefs of passive managers that prevent their action in carbon engagement. So this is great between two agents, but what we've seen a lot recently is great success from coalitions of investors to come together and demand action. So there are some great game theory models that provide insight onto how coalitions of individuals form, coalitions of agencies form. So I wanted to explore that a little bit and see what the impact of those ideas might be. And we're going to ignore this next slide. But one of the things that I talked about with the financial industry contributors was this temptation to free ride on the coalitions that they form. And then when I did the research on this, that doesn't surprise me at all. Because in these end-person situations, there are a couple problems that come with working with so many people. So first of all, if you defect from the group, you socialize your defection. If one person doesn't show up for a meeting, they aren't directing that to anyone in particular. Further, if someone tries to sanction someone else, fine, I'm not going to show up to the next meeting, then everyone in the group suffers as well. And then thirdly, there's anonymity. So all the people who aren't in this conference room right now, I have no idea who they are, for instance. But the good news is that the larger players have a better interest in cooperating with each other. So I think this is something that we're seeing with the lead from institutional investors in forming these coalitions. They have large interest and they want to get together to do something. And then the other good news is that this is one model of cooperation. I think there are actually more appropriate ones that I discovered later. And these involve sort of the side payments and various commitment levels that are more representative of how investors are forming coalitions with each other. Example of clearinghouse mechanisms, that sort of thing. I think this has impacts, especially considering universal owners and how they're beginning to respond to climate change risks. They are now going to have to be willing to take less effort from their peers because they want to achieve any effort at all, because they recognize their universal exposure. So now we know something about coalition formation, we know something about cooperation between two parties, and then we have this sort of 3,000-foot view of what these strategic relationships are. I want to kind of put everything together and take it for a little field test to see in sort of a live setting where divestment strategies would play out, where engagement strategies would play out, and trying to put people into a market game to see if there are multiple companies to interact with, what the results would be. So I built sort of a simple agent-based model, not sort of rigorous according to financial math, but just sort of agent preferences and expected payoffs. What we see here is we have 100 shareholders and they have different size holdings, and they're choosing different strategies over time in interacting with three companies, red, blue, and green. And I've given them in this first scenario different risk profiles, and so we see here that company blue and company green attract a lot more engagement than company red, just given their different risk. But we also see that the early perceiving shareholders move their assets away from blue and especially from green as soon as they perceive carbon risk. I have created an equal risk scenario just to see if anything interesting would happen if I gave two of the companies the same risk amount. Nothing entirely unexpected happened. We saw that green remained a high target for engagement. Again, with a divestment opportunity, so let's give red 0 risk entirely and see if anything interesting happens. Nothing particularly interesting happened. Nothing, but and then finally I created an increasing risk scenario where I started with a baseline risk and then increased that over time, and we saw that engagement increased, especially as the risk grew. But what we also saw was sort of that transfer penalty, which is sort of the pseudo share price between the different companies, got a little bit more unstable. So, in some of the conclusions from that exercise, the proliferation of perception through the shareholders really helped to maintain the stability of the transfer penalty that they were generating, which is sort of this pseudo share price. And then after that price had stabilized, engagement actually fell off. All the engagements said, all the shareholders decided that it wasn't worth their effort anymore because their expected payoffs had sort of all evened out. So what are my conclusions? I have a couple of insights here. For successful engagement, best to keep engagement consistent and low cost. So that is for yourself and for your opposite. To anticipate and mitigate carbon risk for a smooth transition, that's coming from this market game idea. To make the divestment threat credible, if you want to use it as a tool for leverage with any company, and then to engage with policymakers and third parties because their influence might be substantial in the future. From some of the companies that I talked to, the ones who had anticipated carbon risk felt that they were performing better in those engagements with their investors. And then they also noted that they were seeking an early mover advantage to a low carbon business model. And then finally, for policymakers, I think there is a necessity that they still recognize the responsibility for an economy-wide energy transition, and this is especially in the face of universal exposure. And then finally, they can prompt anticipatory action by the market by giving a clear policy direction. So thank you very much.